Good evening, everyone. I wanted to start off with a picture of a cow because it's this cow that seemed to be prolific in breeding in Picton in southwestern Sydney. Yes, it's amazing. There was thousands of the heads of this Central African or South African cow that was called the Hottentot cow, which is known in Botswana, and somehow brought over here. And the narrative is that Governor Phillip came over, bought some cows from South Africa, and brought them over to Sydney Cove, Circular Quay, and there was like 6 or 7 cows. One of them died, so it was like 6 cows, 2 bulls, 4 cows, and they somehow made it out of the ship that they were stored in. The guard was drunk, and they made it all the way over to Picton. They bred and bred and bred. In 1801, there was 500 to 600 head, and then by 1804, there was thousands and thousands of them. Just looking at this map, you can see what I find strange is that they would have crossed all this area of bushland at the time in the late 1700s, and with Aboriginals who were apparently scared of them, amazingly, and they would have travelled 80 kilometres or more to get to Picton. And it would have been quite an effort. And just looking at the rates of breeding, you've got, what have you got? You have 6 cows, and then 12 to 13 years later, it's 500 to 600 head. This is an Australian bush, which is not their native habitat, and there would have been dingoes and that sort of thing. So I don't know how the cars would have made it. And they somehow turned in 1804 was 3,000 to 5,000 till MacArthur got involved. So that's quite an amazing breeding effort. Each calf would have grown up to breed. I mean, it would have been an amazing effort for a new species in the country to be so prolific. But there you are. That's apparently the claim. And they went all the way across the entire part of Sydney, all the way to the other side and across the river. One of the points of reference, if you ever want to figure out when the narrative is fairly reliable, is to work out when the first newspaper started. The Sydney Gazette started around 1804. I think this is its offices from 1810, I believe. So they had premises in 1810 onwards, which is roughly around the time of the Rum Rebellion. They did start in 1803, 1804. So you can pretty much trust that what they're saying is roughly correct. And hence, the narrative from 1803 should be fairly accurate. It's just the point, is anything before 1803 accurate? And that's where it gets really difficult to determine. John Hunter did a record of his transactions from 1787 to 1792, and it's a 400-odd page document. It's quite a dry read, but I went through pretty much all of it, and I'm going to pick out some nice little tidbits to show you that the British were not the first Europeans there by their own admission in a way, and I'll go through it in detail. Some interesting tidbits. All right, so this was finished being written or published in 1793. Apparently, though, I did read somewhere that some of the records did take a while to get republished, and were a few authors. It wasn't just John Hunter. There was apparently a couple of his understudies involved. I'm not too sure. I tried to look online to see any evidence that it was published for sure in 1793, but I did feel that I read somewhere that wasn't published for another couple of decades. He observes a native man of this country who was decently clothed and seemed to be much at ease at the tea table as any person he could manage his cup and saucer well. This is 1 year after the first fleet arrived, and he was accustomed to having tea. That's really strange, and it's completely different to the rest of his narrative about Indigenous peoples. All of his narrative this is unique. He's pointing out that he's trying to make a point that there is something different here, and that this man had an iron shackle to prevent him from going, and this man would refer to these shackles and other trinkets as Bengali, if you can read that, which is just Bengali. Now, Bengali is, of course, the maritime power of Calcutta. I think it's Calcutta. Okay, so Bengali is the main maritime power, and of course they would have done trading all over the place, including going from whale oil and that kind of thing. So they would have been the prominent trading ship. So that's another clue that the Aboriginals of Sydney Cove were occasionally trading in ornaments. Okay, so that's important. By 1789, in May, he says that this smallpox suddenly turns up, and he's all sad to see all the people dead. He's quite sad about it, but I still don't know how smallpox would ever get there if people are on the ship with no smallpox, because you couldn't obviously stay on the ship if you had smallpox, and obviously, so I don't know how that disease could be carried. Maybe it's carried latently. I don't know. So just very interesting that it just turns up, and everyone seems to get it. Rose Hill near Parramatta is the most mentioned site of settlement in this entire narrative. Not Sydney Cove, though that is mentioned. But Rose Hill is the settlement. Now, what I was always told when I was young is that it was always Sydney Cove, cut like the rocks. Second was Parramatta, and close third was Toongabbie. But in this narrative, I keep seeing Rose Hill as the most prominent settlement. Sydney Cove is the second one, and eventually others are mentioned. I'll get to that a bit later. Indian corn is referenced a lot, and I don't know if the British were into Indian corn. It's mentioned a lot. Okay, so another thing that's mentioned is his interest in going and taking a party up to Broken Bay, which is basically the entrance to the Hawkesbury River. All right, so the entrance of the Hawkesbury River is about here, and they wanted to take troops all the way up the roads here to get to here. Now, why would they do that? What is so important? Why don't they just go more inland and around to where there's easy pickings for pasture land or something? Well, this is the area that when you enter and you go along the Hawkesbury River, you can eventually make your way around the Nepean River, and you'll get to Picton, where those cows were. If you wanted to set up a hidden colony away from the British and everyone else, and you were sick and tired of all the European ratbags, the French and everyone, you could probably set up a nice little colony right out in the Southern Highlands, which is probably a good place for it. There's a lot of strange stones and things out there that I've noticed, and it'd be quite likely that you wanted to have a secret colony, you could probably put it out there. Just an idea, and Broken Bay would probably be your best entrance point. And it'll be a long, long winding river, and it'll take you forever to find this colony. Militarily speaking, why you'd want to secure a big open port, a big open port area, harbour like that. They keep going about smallpox. So yes, they see a late teenage young woman. She's got smallpox. And they go on about how they're caring and they're wretched souls and they're trying to look after them. And this is the sort of story you get. The word for water is bardo or bardi. Bardo. Just sort of mention that because it could be a cognate of wadi. You get wadi around Australian Indigenous languages referring to water, and that is a close cognate of the Afghan or the Arabian word for wadi, which is water or a creek or a river. So now I keep finding throughout all of Hunter's recollections that people go missing all the time. So they keep losing people, and they keep saying, "Where are they?" They get lost. They must be all be drunk or something. I don't know. The names of the ships. The Sirius is one ship. So the Sirius is like the important star, the guiding star. So the British would have been part of a long heritage of potentially the occult, which I think we should consider. Justinian and the surprise with the Z. Okay, so Justinian, the naming of that is like from the Justinian Emperor, which was where we get the original Justinian maritime feudal law and that kind of stuff. You've got other ships called Guardian, which is fair enough. Gorgon, which is the original snakehead priestesses of ancient times. I think interesting ship names, sort of mention that. Around 1789, 91, something like that, they hire a Dutch ship, of all things, to take stuff to and from Batavia. Just sort of mention that they had to engage in a Dutch ship because they're running out of supplies and they're desperate. I don't know if the Dutch ship was already going to Sydney or not. I don't know. They built a pyramid on the south head out and in the entrance to Port Jackson, so that people could use it as a reference point. The pyramid is on some of the old original Sydney maps. Interesting is that right at the beginning, there's the British John Hunter, part of the First Fleet and all that. John Hunter was, yeah, so they decide to have such fantastic relations with the French. They go over to make sure they're okay. Can there be of any assistance to Monsieur de la Pérouse? I mean, there's the French and the English have been fighting on and off for wars, and later on in the end of the 19th century, they'll be in fierce battle, and they're just out there as gentlemen, caring for each other. So I find that interesting how they're always trying to get along with the French, which is completely strange. Now, this is where it gets really, really, really strange. Now, I always thought that Australia and like anywhere in the world that you can get paranormal events occurring, and I've known people that have had paranormal experiences, or I've known or someone on the channel that works with me on the channel has had a paranormal experience, knows firsthand, and it is in folklore, a lot of paranormal activity has been well documented in the Australian bush. And this is a strange one. There's apparitions in the country which he calls Mane. He describes them as coming up with a strange noise and catching hold of anyone by their throat. He made use of many words on this occasion and pointed up to the sky. He also informed us that these apparitions singed the beards and the hair. This, he describes, is a very painful operation, rubbing his face after every application of the brand. This is quite spooky in a way, is that you've got this paranormal thing now coming in, and it's written down. You got to understand that the British are seasoned invaders. They would have been the most civilized on the front end, but when you go into the back end and go maybe into deep history, maybe go back to the Scots, or any of them really, they have been involved in black magic, and black magic has been a part of invasion tactics for a long time. So that's probably another topic for another video. I'm not well versed on that, but it's very important to know that there's paranormal phenomena being described. This cannot be described anything else. This can't be lightning. It can't be anything else. This is unusual. And I usually believe things first of all and be open-minded enough if there is testimony. Really interesting, around this same part of the document, we had language being introduced. Now, the females of the tribes around Sydney were referred to as Leon, which is obviously what lion in French, around the French region, and Gal, G-A-L, which is tribe. Now, Gal, this is interesting, these two words, he's chosen this. This could be then a theory on the origin of the pre-British European peoples being probably Gaelic or Western French or Western Spanish, because Leon would mean lion and would probably be related to a woman, and Gal is the clan. So that fits very well, is that Gal, or like as in Portugal, being the people of the port, it would be suitable if you had Gaelic patriarchs probably in the 15th, 16th century coming out there and settling around Sydney and possibly integrating with the locals. It would make sense that they would introduce some of their main language and then adopt the indigenous language for everything else. You would have to go for some analysis to look for the cognates with Tamil and Malay, and you could probably get somewhere with that. I just want to say again is that throughout all of his narrative, he hardly goes on about anything else but Rose Hill and maybe Sydney. He never talks hardly about Parramatta and Toongabbie. Now, when I grew up, I'll say it again, Parramatta was going on and on about that. Everyone went on about Parramatta being, it's close second, and Toongabbie, which is not mentioned at all in his documents, is a close third, but it's not mentioned. So just sort of that, I mentioned that. This is really good here. That's good here. Okay, so it's one of those days around a campfire, whatever, breakfast in this case, and these Indigenous people come, and there was a bright copper colour woman. Her features were pleasing and of that kind of turn that had she been in any European settlement, no one would have doubted her being a mulatto. So that means a hybrid, white and black. And so that's pretty interesting. I wanted to, that pretty much is a giveaway. I mean, there's no way you could have the Indigenous Aborigines as we know them as being mulattoes. No chance of that, which means there was obviously previous European contact. That's pretty much now admitted. The first mention of Pemulwuy of the Bejugal, Gal again, tribe. He is, of course, the fiercest warrior of, I hope I pronounced that right, Pemulwuy. He is the fiercest warrior that the British encountered. Just what you should know that. He is regarded by them as the hero, the main hero of the Indigenous people. Fun. I don't know how the British ever amounted to anything because they had like people dying all the time. There was so much deaths. So it was 156 in 1 year. Pretty bad. Eventually, we get to hear Parramatta and Hawkesbury. It took them all this time for John Hunter to finally say Parramatta and Hawkesbury. Well, that's terrific, isn't it? Okay. Now, what it gets to towards the end, and this is one of the smoking guns, that the Irish are particularly annoying to him, and the Irish are convinced of the Chinese settlements north. Chinese settlements. There you go. They don't really, they think it's fancy, but there. But more importantly, it's the copper-coloured people only 150 miles to the northward, where they would be free. Wow. The copper-coloured people. All right. That's what I call it. Here is the image of the copper-coloured. This is apparently the natives of Botany Bay. To me, people say that that the artists of the day would anglicize or would bleach out or would make their watercolors, they would alter them in order to be more pleasing to the people back home. Now, generally speaking, what I've noticed about these drawings by these explorers is that they would take pride in being technically accurate. You look at all their drawings, whenever you know it's true, it's pretty much spot on where you'd think it would be. They usually do these drawings pretty accurate because they want to take pride in being accurate. They're technical drawings in many respects. This is a map I've went through in another video. This shows, I won't go into detail, but it shows things like Cabramatta, Windsor Road somewhere, and doesn't make any sense why there's an old Windsor Road in the maps. Pretty much as old as the First Fleet, just about. So how do you have anything called old anything where nothing was there in the first place? So there's just these little odd things. Another thing is that just walking around the rocks, Suez Canal was just it's a funny name to call something in the first place, Suez Canal. But the history. This is the official history. The first recorded name, the wider portion of the Suez Canal was Riley's Lane, thought to be a misspelling of the surname of William Riley. Riley is an Irish name. I'm pretty certain the Irish would have been there in step at the same time or even before the British. And they might have bought, I mean, it's very hard to know how things happen. There's all these little anomalies, though. You go around and you say, well, I'm trying to find actual forensic evidence of something. I'm not trying to be fanciful, say, like Tartaria. I'm actually trying to look for the actual smoking gun and the answer. I'm having an enormous amount of difficulty trying to prove something because, it's even pidgin English in Port Jackson. Like, how do you have pidgin English when you're completely arguing with each other and having fights with these locals? I mean, I know you would have to have a pidgin English, but normally It's born out of long-term communication between different cultures over several years to create a pidgin language. But interesting to note, there was a Port Jackson pidgin as well. So, in conclusion, what I feel is that next things that you can do to prove one thing or the other is that you'd have to look at the Governor Phillips' actual records and look at them forensically to see if he's saying something that he's saying something or not. Like the other thing is that you probably need to go to Windsor and Richmond. I find that those places are probably older than we're told, and you'd have to go to the historical societies and try to find out what their earliest floor plans of buildings. There's tunnels out there apparently, so there's a few anomalies that no one knew about, which indicates that that place has a bit of a hidden history to it. You probably have to look into what an independent community is. So you might get a bunch of Irish people going out to modern day Singleton in north of Sydney, which was originally called Patrick, and then that name gets changed. So sometimes you've got to understand that independent communities could have happened concurrently to the British coming, and then so maybe not long time prior to the British, but they set up shop, they do all the hard work, they get to know the natives, they form peaceful relations, and the British come and screw all that up. That's probably how you need to look at things. My conclusions are, to date, is that there is megalithic evidence around Sydney, and people like Rex Gilroy have done a huge amount of work proving that there's been semi-civilized cultures going back hundreds of thousands of years across Australia, including Sydney. I think that there was definitely moderate Asian and European influences, probably not a huge township in around Sydney. I cannot justify how you could have 5,000 head of cattle in Picton. I suspect that Governor Phillip did not record all his actions. I know that the early governors prevented people from passing the Nepean River, and it was a no-go zone. So I suspect that their soldiers were secretly out there dealing with the problem of free settlers and the indigenous, and they probably would have taken any cattle and moved them northward towards Picton. I suspect that these are Southern Highlands cattle that was probably mustered up north towards Picton after they successfully took over some of the pre-British settlements that may not have been heavily civilized, but they might have been, people who have come prior to the British. I suspect that is the most likely scenario, and they probably accessed those areas via either Jervis Bay, Lake Illawarra, Broken Bay up north. That probably would have been the access points. Probably not heavily populated, but either way, no one was allowed to go out there, and they probably were doing the deeds to get rid of any evidence of previous occupation, and then the cattle was just brought forward. That's the most logical. I can see the Indian Bengali influences. I can see there's obviously copper-colored people and there's Chinese communities. So now, what does that leave us? Was there a huge fake narrative? Was there a massive township with lots and lots of buildings for previous culture in Sydney? No, I don't think so. I do think that when I investigate Adelaide, Melbourne, and some regional Victoria and Tasmania, yes, I find that there was a stark problem with the narrative. That is probably where you're going to find your big gaps. But I decided to do Sydney to make sure that I had covered off on it. That's it. Thank you.